Your little hobby shed is a blight on this community, Mr. Evans. And according to Article 7, Section 4, subsection B of the Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, we have the authority to have it removed at your expense. The voice, a grating mix of condescension and manufactured authority, belonged to Karen Miller, the recently crowned president of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She stood just on her side of my property line. A thick woman of about 55 poured into a beige pantsuit that seemed to be losing a desperate battle against gravity. In her hand, she clutched a clipboard like a royal scepter, her knuckles white. Taped to the heavy steel door of my workshop was a bright orange piece of paper, a condemnation notice flapping in the afternoon breeze. It cited aesthetic nuisance and unapproved structural modifications, bureaucratic jargon for "I don't like the look of it." The financial implications hit me like a physical blow. The specialized equipment inside that building, my CNC mill, my lathes, my diagnostic arrays, was worth well over six figures, and the workshop itself was more than a building. It was my sanctuary, my laboratory, the place where I decompressed after 20 years as an Army combat engineer, trading the complexities of diffusing IEDs for the cleaner complexities of physics and engineering. Karen just stood there, a smug, self-satisfied smirk playing on her lips, waiting for me to crumble. She saw a quiet veteran who kept to himself and assumed he was a pushover. She had no idea how wrong she was. If you've ever dealt with a power-tripping HOA president who thinks they're the queen of a tiny beige kingdom, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I want to hear your HOA nightmare stories because I promise you, this one is a doozy. This whole mess started not with a bang, but with the slow, creeping rot of suburban tyranny. I inherited this 5-acre plot from my grandfather. He built the house in the large detached workshop back in 1978, long before any developer dreamed of paving over the surrounding farmland and christening it with a name as vapid as Whispering Pines. My property was an island of history in a sea of beige stucco and perfectly manicured, chemically treated lawns. The HOA was a legal necessity of the development, a fact I accepted. I paid my dues on time, which covered maintenance for the cookie-cutter community pool and the pathetic little playground I never used. In return, I expected to be left alone. For years, that unspoken agreement held. Then 2 years ago, the Millers moved in. Karen, with a surplus of time and a deficit of purpose after her husband's retirement, saw the HOA not as a civic duty, but as a throne. She campaigned with the ferocity of a warlord, promising to uphold community standards and protect property values, which was code for harassing anyone whose life didn't fit neatly into her narrow, unimaginative worldview. Her reign began with a series of petty edicts. My grass was a quarter-inch too high. My garbage cans were visible from the street for 3 hours too long on collection day. Each infraction came with a crisply printed violation notice, a passive-aggressive prelude to the war she was about to declare. But the workshop, that was her obsession. It was a sturdy, practical, metal-sided building, set far back on my property, almost completely obscured from the road by a line of mature pine trees my grandfather had planted. To her, it was an unforgivable offense, a brutalist scar on her canvas of suburban perfection. She called it a shed, a shack, a barn. She couldn't comprehend that inside that simple structure, I was designing and building the future. After retiring from the Army, I'd poured my savings and my sanity into my own R&D company, focusing on high-efficiency renewable energy components. My hobby shed was a state-of-the-art facility, and my work was on the cusp of revolutionizing solar energy collection. But to Karen, it was just an ugly building that didn't match the HOA-approved color palette, and that, in her tiny kingdom, was a crime worthy of condemnation. I let her stand there for a long moment, savoring her perceived victory, before I walked over to the workshop door. I didn't rip the notice off in a rage. I carefully peeled back the tape at each corner, folded the paper with military precision, and slid it into my back pocket. I turned to face her, my expression unreadable. "Karen," I said, my voice low and even, "you're trespassing, and you've made a serious miscalculation." Her smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before the mask of self-righteousness slammed back into place. The community common area extends 10 feet from the road, Mr. Evans. I am well within my rights. The notice stands. You have 30 days to submit a plan for demolition, or the HOA will contract the work and place a lien on your property for the cost. She turned on her heel and marched back toward her oversized SUV, the clipboard held high, a conqueror returning from a successful campaign. I stood there, the warm sun on my face, the scent of pine in the air, and felt not fear, but a cold, clarifying anger. This wasn't about a building. This was about control. She had chosen her battlefield. Now I would choose the weapons, and my weapons weren't going to be angry words or petty violations. My weapons were going to be research, strategy, and the full crushing weight of the law. The war had begun. The first step in any engagement is reconnaissance. You don't charge blindly into the fight. You study the terrain, understand the enemy, and identify their weaknesses. I went inside, spread the condemnation notice and a copy of the Whispering Pines CC&RS across my heavy oak dining table, and began to dissect Karen's attack. Article 7, Section 4, Subsection B was a masterpiece of intentional vagueness, a catch-all clause about maintaining community aesthetic harmony and prohibiting any structure not in keeping with the architectural style of the development. It was the kind of language lawyers love and tyrants exploit, giving the board carte blanche to define harmony and style however they saw fit. But Karen had made a critical error. She assumed I wouldn't read the rest of the document. Buried deep in the appendices, in a section titled Pre-existing Conditions and Properties, was a grandfather clause. It explicitly stated that any permanent structures existing on a property prior to the establishment of the HOA in 2008 were exempt from architectural review, provided they were maintained in good repair. My workshop was built in 1978. It was immaculate. Checkmate, or so I thought. My next step was to build a dossier. I spent the rest of the afternoon with my camera, documenting my property from every conceivable angle. I took photos from the street, showing how the dense line of loblolly pines my grandfather planted completely shielded the workshop from view. You had to be actively looking for it to even catch a glimpse of the roofline. I took photos from my neighbor's property, with his permission, and from the drone I used for aerial surveying of my solar prototypes, creating a comprehensive visual record that proved the aesthetic nuisance claim was a bald-faced lie. Then I went to the county records office, a dusty repository of deeds and surveys that smelled of old paper and quiet history. I pulled the original plat map for my land, dated 1976, and the building permit for the workshop, dated 1978. I had them digitized and printed in high resolution. This wasn't just my word against hers. This was a documented, verifiable timeline that predated her entire subdivision. Armed with a binder thick enough to stop a small caliber round, I attended the next monthly HOA meeting. It was held in the community clubhouse, a sterile beige room that smelled faintly of chlorine and desperation. Karen sat at the head of a long table, flanked by her board of directors, a collection of sycophants and bored retirees who seemed to derive their only sense of purpose from her approval. I waited patiently through tedious discussions about seasonal flower arrangements and pool pump maintenance. When the floor was open for homeowner concerns, I was the first to the microphone. I didn't yell, I didn't accuse. I calmly and methodically presented my case, just as I would have briefed a commanding officer. My name is Mark Evans. I live at 412 Pine Ridge Road, I began, my voice steady. 2 weeks ago, I received this condemnation notice for my workshop. I placed a copy on the overhead projector, the orange paper glowing like a warning. The notice cites a violation of Article 7. However, I'd like to draw the board's attention to Appendix C, Section 2. I switched the slide to the grandfather clause. This clause exempts pre-existing structures. My workshop was built in 1978. Here is the county-stamped building permit. I displayed the permit, a crisp digital copy. And here is the original property plat, predating this entire development. I walked them through the evidence, piece by piece, laying out an airtight, logical defense. The room was silent. A few of the residents, people I recognized but had never really spoken to, were nodding along, their faces showing flickers of interest and support. I had assumed that facts and reason would prevail. That was my second miscalculation. Karen let me finish, a tight, unpleasant smile fixed on her face. She didn't even look at my documents. "Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Evans," she said, her tone dripping with false patience. "However, the board has already discussed this matter. The grandfather clause, as you can see if you read it carefully, applies to the primary residential dwelling. It was intended to cover the original farmhouses. Your outbuilding is an unpermitted commercial enterprise being operated in a residential zone, which is a separate and more serious violation." The word unpermitted was a lie, and she knew it. The shift to commercial enterprise was a new line of attack, a desperate pivot. "It's a workshop for my personal projects," I countered, keeping my voice level. "It is not a commercial enterprise." "Oh, really?" she shot back, her voice rising. "We have reports of loud noises at all hours, strange lights, and commercial-grade deliveries. It's clearly some kind of factory. It's a safety hazard and a nuisance." The reports were fabrications, another lie pulled from thin air. The board members nodded dutifully, their expressions carefully neutral. They were her puppets, and she was pulling the strings. "The board has voted to deny your appeal," Karen declared, her voice ringing with finality. "The 30-day notice stands. Next item on the agenda." She banged her gavel, a sharp crack that echoed the closing of a door in my face. I stood there at the microphone for a moment, the binder of evidence in my hand, suddenly feeling useless. I had walked in expecting a reasonable discussion. Instead, I had been publicly dismissed and slandered. I looked at the faces in the crowd. Some looked away, uncomfortable. Others watched me with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew this was wrong, but they were too intimidated to speak up. As I walked back to my seat, the humiliation burned hotter than any anger. I realized this was never about a building, or a rule, or even aesthetic harmony. This was a raw, naked power play. Karen wasn't just trying to remove my workshop. She was trying to break me, to make an example of me for anyone else who dared to defy her rule. And in that sterile, beige room, I made a silent vow. She wanted a war. She was going to get one. But it wouldn't be fought on her terms. In her little clubhouse meetings, it would be fought on my terms, in a much larger arena, and she would never ever see it coming. The first volley after the disastrous HOA meeting was a barrage of paper. The fines began arriving in my mailbox, each envelope a crisp white harbinger of Karen's escalating aggression. $100 per day for failure to comply with a board directive. The fee was arbitrary, punitive, and designed to bleed me out. Within 2 weeks, the bill was already at $1,400, a figure that would be laughable if it weren't attached to the threat of a lien against my home. Then came the letters from the HOA's legal counsel, a firm named Abernathy, Finch, and Todd. The letters were penned by Todd, a junior partner whose smug photo on the firm's website showed a man with too much hair gel and not enough soul. His letters were dense with legalese, citing obscure county codes and HOA bylaws, all twisted to support Karen's narrative that my workshop was a rogue industrial complex dropped into her pristine suburban utopia. They threatened further legal action, foreclosure, and essentially the complete and total ruin of my peaceful life. They were trying to bury me in an avalanche of paperwork and intimidation, assuming I'd either give up or make a fatal mistake. Instead of panicking, I got methodical. Every letter, every fine, every piece of correspondence was scanned, dated, and filed in a new, thicker binder labeled Karen. This wasn't just harassment anymore. It was a campaign. And every campaign has a logistical trail. While their lawyers were busy drafting threats, I was digging. I spent my evenings not in my workshop, but in front of my computer, diving deep into the digital rabbit hole of public records. I scoured County Planning Commission websites, read the minutes from every HOA meeting for the past 2 years, and cross-referenced every name on the board with local business filings. I was looking for a weakness, a motive beyond simple petty malice. Why was Karen so obsessed with my specific piece of land? What was her endgame? The answer, when it came, was hidden in plain sight, buried in a dry, 200-page feasibility study attached to the minutes of a special HOA board meeting from 6 months prior. The document was titled Whispering Pines Community Green Initiative. It was Karen's magnum opus, her legacy project. She was pushing the HOA to secure a multi-million-dollar loan to build a community solar farm on a 3-acre parcel of common land that coincidentally abutted the far corner of my property. The project promised to lower residents' energy bills, increase property values, and, most importantly, cement Karen's status as a visionary leader. It was ambitious, expensive, and entirely dependent on cutting-edge technology to be profitable. I leaned closer to the screen, my heart starting to beat a little faster. The study went into granular detail about the technology they planned to use. It wasn't just off-the-shelf solar panels. The proposal specified a new proprietary dual-axis tracking system that could increase energy capture by over 40% compared to fixed arrays. It described a unique, lightweight mounting bracket designed for rapid installation and resistance to high winds. And it detailed a sophisticated power conversion controller that minimized energy loss between the panels and the grid. The language was highly technical, filled with engineering specifications and performance metrics. It was also deeply, terrifyingly familiar. My blood went cold. I pushed back from the desk and walked, almost in a trance, out to my workshop, the place she called a shed, the place she wanted to tear down. I unlocked the door and flipped on the lights. Against one wall were the prototypes. There it was, the dual-axis tracker, its gears and servos gleaming under the fluorescent lights. On a workbench sat the mounting bracket, a marvel of lightweight, high-strength alloy I'd spent a year perfecting. And on my main diagnostic station was the breadboard for the conversion controller, a complex web of circuits and processors that represented thousands of hours of work. I went back inside and logged into the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. I pulled up my own records. Patent number 9,887,645, heliostat tracking system for photovoltaic arrays. Patent number 10,211,789, aerodynamic low-profile mounting assembly for solar panels. Patent number 10,543,912, adaptive solid-state photovoltaic power inverter. I put the feasibility study's technical specs side by side with my patent abstracts. They weren't just similar, they were identical. The diagrams, the performance data, the very language used to describe the innovations, it was all lifted directly from my work, likely from industry journals or conference papers I'd published. Karen Miller, in her blind quest for power and prestige, was leading her entire community to invest millions of dollars in a project whose core technology was owned by the very man she was trying to destroy. She wanted to bulldoze my workshop, but the blueprints for her glorious solar farm were created inside it. The irony was so profound, so perfect, it was almost poetic. A slow smile spread across my face. This was no longer a defensive action. I wasn't just fighting a lien or a condemnation order anymore. I had found her center of gravity, the single point upon which her entire campaign rested, and I was about to reach out and flick it, toppling her entire self-made empire. The game had changed. The first phone call I made was to Dave Martinez. We'd served together in the 3rd Engineer Battalion, him in the JAG Corps, me in the field. He'd gotten me out of a few bureaucratic scrapes with the brass, and I'd once hot-wired a general's Humvee to get him to a flight on time. We trusted each other implicitly. Now he ran a small, ferociously effective law firm in the city, specializing in intellectual property and property rights. He was, in short, the perfect man for this job. I laid out the entire situation on a secure video call, from Karen's first violation notice to the patent infringement in the solar farm proposal. As I spoke, a predatory grin spread across Dave's face. He looked like a wolf who had just stumbled upon a flock of sheep who'd accidentally locked themselves out of their pen. "Mark, my friend," he said, leaning into his camera, "this is not a case. This is a work of art. It's a legal masterpiece of self-inflicted wounds. They are literally trying to condemn the factory that makes the golden eggs they need for their omelet. They have no idea, do they?" "Not a clue," I confirmed. "They think I'm just some retired grunt tinkering with birdhouses in my shed." "Oh, this is going to be beautiful," he mused, already sketching notes on a legal pad. "We don't just go after them. We let them build their own gallows. We let them walk so deep into this trap that they can't see daylight. Our strategy, formulated over the next hour, was a two-pronged attack. Phase 1 was the distraction, a direct legal challenge to the condemnation itself. Dave drafted a blistering cease and desist letter addressed to Karen and the HOA board. It was a masterclass in legal intimidation, citing state and federal harassment laws, targeted enforcement, abuse of authority, and the undeniable evidence of the grandfather clause. It demanded they immediately rescind all fines and cease all actions against my property, or we would file a lawsuit seeking punitive damages. We sent it via certified mail with return receipt requested, a formal shot across their bow. Phase 2 was the quiet offensive. While Karen and her pet lawyer Todd were busy sputtering over our letter, I started my groundwork in the neighborhood. This couldn't just be my fight. To truly dismantle Karen's power structure, I needed the community. I started with my next-door neighbor, a quiet accountant named George, who Karen had fined for having a non-conforming mailbox. It was dark gray instead of the HOA-approved black. I moved on to Mr. Henderson down the street, an elderly widower and avid gardener whose prize-winning roses were deemed overly exuberant and in violation of landscaping rules. Then there was the Rodriguez family, a young couple with 3 kids who were in a constant battle with Karen over their children's basketball hoop, which had to be taken down and stored every single night. I approached them cautiously, not with a call to arms, but with a simple question and a folder of documents. "Have you also been having issues with the HOA board lately?" I'd ask. Then I would listen. Their stories poured out, tales of petty tyranny, arbitrary fines, and a constant low-grade fear of receiving another white envelope in the mail. Each story was a piece of a larger mosaic, a clear and undeniable pattern of abuse. Karen didn't enforce rules. She targeted people. She went after anyone who was different, who didn't fit her mold, or who simply wouldn't bow down to her. I showed them my binder, the condemnation notice, the evidence. I didn't mention the patents or the solar farm yet. That was my ace in the hole. For now, the goal was to build a coalition based on our shared experience of being bullied. A quiet rebellion began to brew in the manicured cul-de-sacs of Whispering Pines. We started a private email chain, sharing information, comparing notes, and documenting every interaction with Karen and her board. The fear that had kept everyone isolated began to dissolve, replaced by a growing sense of shared resolve. We were no longer just a collection of disgruntled homeowners. We were an alliance. Karen thought she was fighting a lone wolf. She had no idea she was taking on a pack. The HOA's response to Dave's cease and desist letter was exactly as arrogant and dismissive as we had predicted. It came from Todd, the slick lawyer, and was a monument to condescension. He accused us of frivolous legal maneuvering and stated that the board would not be intimidated by baseless threats. He doubled down, claiming they had now accumulated numerous complaints from my neighbors about the noise and safety hazards emanating from my workshop. A laughable fiction, as my new allies were now forwarding me copies of the glowing character references they had sent to the HOA on my behalf, which the board had clearly ignored. Most importantly, Todd's letter officially informed us that the HOA had formally petitioned the County Zoning and Planning Commission for a condemnation order against my property. They had escalated the conflict from an internal HOA dispute to a public governmental action. They had just taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker. By filing with the county, they had created an official, public paper trail linking their vendetta against me to my specific property. They had unwittingly built the foundation for their own demise. While they were congratulating themselves on their legal fortitude, the solar project was steaming ahead. The HOA scheduled a special town hall meeting to make a grand announcement. It was a classic Karen production, complete with cheap balloons in the community's official colors, taupe and forest green, and a sheet cake from the local grocery store. She stood at the podium, beaming under the fluorescent lights, and announced that the board had officially signed a contract with a reputable firm called Greenleaf Renewables to build the Whispering Pines Community Solar Farm. It was, she declared, the dawn of a new era of sustainability and fiscal responsibility for our community. I sat in the back of the room, a silent observer in a baseball cap, watching the spectacle unfold. A representative from Greenleaf, a young, earnest man in a blazer, gave a presentation filled with glossy renderings and optimistic financial projections. And there on the giant screen behind him were the schematics. My schematics. The distinctive curve of my tracker, the unique profile of my mounting bracket. He was proudly showcasing my intellectual property as the cornerstone of their multi-million-dollar project. After the presentation, during the celebratory cake eating, I casually wandered over to a table where several packets of the Greenleaf proposal had been left. I slipped one into my jacket. It was the final piece of evidence I needed, a signed official contract and proposal that explicitly detailed their intent to use technology that infringed on all three of my patents. I drove home that night with a grim sense of satisfaction. Karen and her board, in their hubris, had just signed a contract with a stolen pen. They had committed the community's finances, their own reputations, and the future of their legacy project to a foundation of intellectual property theft. They had meticulously loaded the gun, polished the barrel, and aimed it squarely at their own feet. All that was left for me to do was to help them pull the trigger. The trap was now perfectly set. The HOA's condemnation request was officially filed and pending with the county. The multi-million-dollar contract between the HOA and Greenleaf Renewables was signed, sealed, and delivered. Karen was undoubtedly basking in the glow of her dual victories, savoring the imminent destruction of my workshop and the triumphant launch of her solar farm. She was on top of the world, utterly oblivious to the fact that she was standing on a trapdoor. It was time for Dave to unleash the legal kraken. We didn't fire a warning shot this time. We launched a coordinated, multi-front assault designed to create maximum chaos and confusion, targeting not the HOA directly, but the pillars holding up their entire project. The first letter, a thick and menacing packet sent via overnight courier, went to the CEO of Greenleaf Renewables at their corporate headquarters in another state. It was a meticulously crafted cease and desist letter, unlike any they had ever seen. It began by politely informing them that their Whispering Pines project was based entirely on technology protected by U.S. patents, 9,887,645, 10,211,789, and 10,543,912. It included copies of the patent certificates, detailed technical drawings from my own files, and a side-by-side comparison with the schematics from their own proposal, highlighting the indisputable infringement. The letter accused them of willful patent infringement, a charge that carries the potential for treble damages in court. It demanded an immediate cessation of all work and communication related to the project. As a final flourish, Dave included a draft of the federal lawsuit we were fully prepared to file, which named Greenleaf, the HOA, and Karen Miller personally as defendants, and sought damages that would likely bankrupt the company and the community. The second letter went to the County Planning Commission. It was more formal, a notification of a pending legal dispute. It informed the commission that the core technology of a major project currently under their review for permits was subject to a significant intellectual property conflict. It gently but firmly suggested that any permits issued for the project would be done so with the full knowledge of this dispute, potentially exposing the county itself to legal liability for approving a project based on stolen technology. Bureaucrats hate liability more than anything else in the world. This letter was designed to grind the gears of government to a screeching halt. The third letter was delivered to the senior vice president of commercial lending at the regional bank that was financing the HOA's massive loan for the project. Similar to the letter to the county, it informed the bank that the entire premise of the project they were funding was built on a legal fiction. It explained that the technology which made the project financially viable was not owned or licensed by the HOA or their contractor, and was now the subject of a major federal lawsuit. We pointed out that their multi-million-dollar investment was secured by an asset that could not legally be built, making their loan incredibly high risk. Banks, like bureaucrats, despise risk. The letters were sent simultaneously on a Tuesday morning. We sent nothing to Karen, nothing to Todd, nothing to the HOA board. Our strategy was to let the world crash down on them from the outside. We wanted the first inkling of trouble Karen had to be a frantic, screaming phone call from a CEO hundreds of miles away, or a panicked summons from a county official, or a cold, formal notice from her bank. We wanted her to be completely and utterly blindsided, surrounded by the wreckage of her own ambition before she even knew what hit her. We lit the fuses, and then we sat back and waited for the explosions. The silence lasted for exactly 27 hours. Then, the shock waves from our legal carpet bombing began to hit Whispering Pines, and the fallout was glorious. I imagined the sequence of events with a certain cinematic satisfaction. The first call to Karen was likely from the CEO of Greenleaf Renewables, a man whose pleasant demeanor from the town hall had probably been replaced by the apoplectic rage of someone staring down the barrel of a multi-million-dollar lawsuit and a public relations nightmare. He would have demanded to know why the HOA had misrepresented their rights to the technology, why they had failed to do the most basic due diligence. The conversation would not have been pleasant. Next, her phone would have rung with a call from the county planning department. A placid, monotone bureaucrat would have informed her that all permit applications for the Community Green Initiative had been placed on indefinite administrative hold, pending the resolution of a significant intellectual property encumbrance. The jargon would have been her first clue that this was something far beyond a simple zoning issue. The final, and perhaps most devastating call, would have been from the bank. A grim-faced loan officer would have informed her that due to the material adverse change in the project's legal status, the bank was freezing the entire multi-million-dollar credit line. The money was gone. Her project was dead in the water, starved of funds. Karen, who had started the week as the conquering hero of her suburban kingdom, was now at the center of a self-made catastrophe, and she still didn't even know my name was attached to it. The beauty of our strategy was that it completely bypassed her. She was the cause of the problem, but the consequences were being delivered to her by her powerful partners, who were now looking at her as a liability at best and a fraud at worst. The community, of course, was a tinderbox of gossip. The preliminary site work for the solar farm, which had started with a triumphant groundbreaking ceremony just a week earlier, came to an abrupt halt. A lone bulldozer sat silent in the field, a monument to the project's sudden demise. Rumors began to fly, fueled by the information vacuum. Was the contractor incompetent? Did the HOA run out of money? Was the land contaminated? This was where my alliance of disgruntled neighbors went to work. We didn't need to shout the truth from the rooftops. We just started having quiet conversations, over fences, in the grocery store aisle, at the community mailbox. We calmly explained the situation, sticking to the verifiable facts. Did you hear about the solar project? It turns out the board signed a contract for technology they didn't have the rights to use. The whole thing is on hold because of a patent dispute. The board never checked who owned the designs. The man they're trying to force out, Mark Evans, it's his technology. The board is trying to condemn his workshop while simultaneously trying to build a project based on the work he does inside it. The story was so perfectly, beautifully ironic that it spread like wildfire. The narrative quickly shifted. Karen was no longer the visionary leader. She was a reckless, incompetent fool who had exposed the entire community to financial ruin and legal jeopardy out of a personal vendetta. The anger that had been simmering beneath the surface for 2 years finally boiled over. Mr. Shirty Henderson, the quiet gardener, drafted a petition calling for an emergency community meeting to demand a full explanation from the board regarding the catastrophic failure of leadership and due diligence. He walked it door to door. In less than 24 hours, it had signatures from over 70% of the homeowners. Under the HOA's own bylaws, Karen had no choice but to schedule the meeting. The stage was set for the final showdown. She was being forced to face the very people she ruled, to answer for a disaster of her own making, and I would be sitting in the front row to watch it all unfold. The night of the emergency meeting, the community clubhouse was packed so tightly, it felt like the walls were breathing. Every seat was taken, people were standing 3 deep along the back wall, and a small crowd had spilled out onto the patio, peering through the windows. The atmosphere was thick with a mixture of anger, betrayal, and a kind of grim, anticipatory excitement. This wasn't a meeting, it was a tribunal. At the front of the room at their long table sat Karen and her board of directors. They looked like prisoners in the dock. The usual smug confidence was gone, replaced by a pasty, defensive pallor. Karen's beige pantsuit seemed to have shrunk, and she nervously shuffled a stack of papers that she never once looked at. To her right sat Todd, the HOA lawyer, looking deeply uncomfortable in his expensive suit, his eyes darting around the room as if seeking an escape route. To her left sat the CEO of Greenleaf Renewables, a man who had flown in specifically for this meeting, his face a granite mask of corporate fury. He was not there to support Karen. He was there to witness her immolation. The new interim board president, Mr. Henderson, a man whose gentle demeanor concealed a spine of pure steel, called the meeting to order. He didn't grandstand. He simply stated the purpose of the meeting: to understand how the HOA's flagship project had collapsed into a legal and financial disaster. Then he opened the floor. He let the residents speak first, a brilliant strategic move. One by one, my allies stood up and told their stories. Mr. Henderson himself spoke first, his voice trembling slightly with emotion as he recounted the endless, petty harassment over his rose bushes. Mrs. Rodriguez followed, her voice strong and clear as she detailed the constant threats and fines over her children's basketball hoop. A dozen others followed, each story adding a new layer to the indictment, painting a damning portrait of Karen's reign. They spoke of arbitrary enforcement, of vindictive fines, of a leader who ruled by fear and intimidation. For the first time, the entire community was hearing the scope of her abuse, not as isolated incidents, but as a systematic campaign of tyranny. Then Mr. Henderson called my name. I walked to the podium, carrying a small laptop. The room fell silent. I connected my computer to the overhead projector, and the first image that flashed on the screen was the bright orange condemnation notice from my workshop door. "This is where it began for me," I said, my voice calm and measured. "A notice to destroy my property, based on a lie." I clicked to the next slide, showing the grandfather clause from their own bylaws, highlighted in yellow. Click, a spreadsheet detailing the daily fines. Click, the arrogant, dismissive letters from their lawyer. I walked them through Karen's entire vendetta, step by documented step. The room was utterly still, the only sound the quiet clicks of my presentation. Finally, I arrived at the heart of the matter. I projected 3 images side by side on the screen. On the left, the official certificate for my first patent. In the middle, a technical schematic from the Greenleaf proposal. On the right, a photograph of the prototype sitting in my workshop. The 3 images were identical. I did the same for the other 2 patents. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as the truth dawned on them in real time. "For 2 years," I said, turning to face the board directly, "your president has waged a relentless campaign to destroy my workshop. She has called it a shed, a blight, an unpermitted commercial enterprise. She has slandered me, fined me, and tried to use the power of the county to bulldoze my life's work. And in all that time, in her blind, arrogant pursuit of power, she never once bothered to ask a simple question: what do you actually do in that workshop?" I let the question hang in the air, a final, damning indictment. "The answer," I continued, my voice dropping, "is that I invent the future. A future that this board tried to build its legacy on, using technology they stole from the very man they were trying to ruin." The silence that followed was profound, a vacuum of shock and comprehension. Then the dam broke. The room erupted. It wasn't just murmuring now, it was shouting. People were on their feet, pointing at Karen, their faces contorted with rage. The CEO of Greenleaf stood up, took the microphone, and made a short, brutal statement. He announced that his company was officially placing the Whispering Pines contract under review for gross misrepresentation and a catastrophic failure of fiduciary due diligence on the part of the HOA board. He then turned, looked directly at Karen with utter contempt, and walked out of the room. The chaos intensified. Someone started chanting, "Resign, resign, resign." And soon the whole room picked it up, a thunderous roar of public condemnation. Karen sat frozen, her face ashen. Todd the lawyer was frantically packing his briefcase, trying to become invisible. Her reign was over. It had ended not with a gavel, but with a roar of democratic fury, in the very room she had once commanded like a queen. The immediate aftermath was swift and brutal. Faced with open revolt from the community and the complete collapse of her signature project, Karen's authority evaporated in an instant. A motion for a vote of no confidence was made from the floor. It was seconded by a dozen voices at once. Mr. Henderson conducted the vote with solemn efficiency. It was nearly unanimous. Karen and her entire slate of board members were removed from power, effective immediately. They sat there, stunned into silence, as their little empire crumbled around them. They were forced to gather their things and perform a walk of shame out of the clubhouse, through the jeering crowd of homeowners they had once terrorized. An interim board was elected on the spot, with Mr. Henderson as the new president, and the Rodriguez couple and several other reasonable, respected members of the community filling the other seats. Their first official act was to unanimously vote to rescind the condemnation order and all fines against me. The war was over. I had won. The next morning, my phone rang. It was Mr. Henderson. He was polite, deeply apologetic for what I had endured, and formally requested a meeting. He wanted to bring the CEO of Greenleaf Renewables, who had stayed in town for this exact purpose. He asked where we could meet. My workshop, I said. I think it's important they see it. They arrived an hour later, two men in expensive suits looking profoundly out of place as they walked up my gravel driveway. I led them to the workshop, the building Karen had called a blight. I swung open the heavy steel door and flipped on the lights. Their reaction was exactly what I had hoped for. Their jaws literally dropped. They stepped inside and just stared, slowly turning in a circle. They saw the gleaming, computer-controlled milling machine, the digital lathes, the advanced oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers, the meticulously organized workstations, and the prototypes in various stages of development. The Greenleaf CEO ran his hand over the polished metal of a tracker assembly. "My God," he whispered, "this isn't a workshop. This is a world-class R&D facility." The hobby shed narrative was dead and buried. We sat down at a heavy workbench, the smell of machine oil and ozone in the air, and we began to talk. It wasn't a negotiation in the traditional sense. I held every single card. They knew it, and I knew it. They started with profuse apologies, which I accepted calmly. Then they asked what it would take to make things right and get the solar project back on track. I had spent the previous night preparing my terms. I laid them out not as demands, but as the necessary conditions for moving forward. Term 1, I began. The HOA will issue a formal, public apology in the community newsletter to me and to every other resident who was subjected to targeted harassment by the previous board. All fines levied by Karen's board over the last 2 years will be rescinded and refunded, with interest. Mr. Henderson nodded immediately. Done. Term 2. The HOA's CC&Rs are a weapon waiting for another tyrant. You will hire an independent legal firm, not Todd, to conduct a complete review and overhaul of the bylaws. Vague, subjective language will be eliminated. A clear, transparent process for homeowner appeals will be established, with an independent arbitration option. Absolutely, Henderson agreed. It's long overdue. Term 3, the HOA will reimburse me for all of my legal fees incurred during this dispute. My lawyer is very good, and he is not cheap. The Greenleaf CEO spoke up. My company will cover that, Mr. Evans. Consider it a down payment on our new partnership. And that brings us to term 4, I said, leaning forward. The solar project. I am willing to grant Greenleaf Renewables a license to use my patented technologies for this project and others. The CEO breathed a visible sigh of relief. My terms for the license are standard for the industry. However, I have one special condition. A significant percentage of the annual licensing royalties, let's say 40%, will not be paid to me. It will be paid directly into a new, transparently managed community improvement and innovation fund. That fund will be used for things this community actually needs. Scholarships for our kids, better maintenance for our parks, community events that bring people together, maybe even seed money for other local innovators. My technology won't just lower your electric bills. It will actively invest in your community's future. The two men looked at each other, stunned. Then the Greenleaf CEO broke into a wide, genuine smile. Mr. Evans, he said, extending his hand, that is more than fair. It's brilliant. We shook hands. In the place where Karen had tried to plant a flag of conquest, we had just laid the foundation for a new beginning, built not on rules and punishment, but on innovation, respect, and shared prosperity. The final act of the drama played out not in a tense meeting, but on a quiet Tuesday morning a few weeks later. An unmarked landscaping truck rumbled up to my property. The new HOA, under Mr. Henderson's leadership, had insisted on removing a large dead pine tree near the road as a tangible gesture of goodwill. As the crew fired up their chainsaws, another much larger truck pulled up across the street, its reverse alarm beeping mournfully. It was a moving truck, and it was parked in front of Karen Miller's house. She was selling. She couldn't face the community she had so spectacularly failed to conquer. I was on my porch, sipping a cup of coffee, watching the two scenes unfold. The removal of something dead and rotten on my property, and the removal of something toxic from across the street. As the movers wrestled a large ornate sofa out her front door, Karen herself emerged. She saw me standing there. Our eyes met across the perfectly manicured lawns and the quiet suburban street. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the old defiance in her eyes, a spark of the bitter resentment that had fueled her entire crusade. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a hollow, defeated emptiness. She didn't glare. She didn't speak. She just gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of her head, turned and got into the passenger seat of her oversized SUV. A few minutes later, the car pulled out of the driveway, and without a backward glance, Karen Miller drove out of Whispering Pines Estates for the last time. Her reign of petty tyranny was officially, definitively over. A month later, I stood on a small temporary stage in the middle of the field, bordering my property. The silent bulldozer was gone, replaced by a crowd of cheerful residents, construction equipment adorned with festive ribbons, and a row of gleaming golden shovels. It was the official groundbreaking ceremony for the newly revived Whispering Pines Community Solar Farm. Mr. Henderson gave a short, heartfelt speech. He spoke about new beginnings and the importance of community. He thanked Greenleaf Renewables. And then he turned to me. He didn't just thank me for the technology. Mark Evans, he said, his voice carrying over the crowd, did more than just save this project. He reminded us that a community is built on respect, not rules, on cooperation, not coercion. He showed us that the greatest resource we have in this neighborhood isn't our manicured lawns or our property values, but the talent, ingenuity, and character of the people who live here. The applause was warm and genuine. After the ceremony, people came up to shake my hand, to clap me on the back, to welcome me into the community that I had technically been a part of for years, but had never truly felt connected to until now. I looked out at the field where the foundations for the solar arrays were being marked, the arrays that would soon be powered by my inventions. Then I looked back toward my home, toward the sturdy, unassuming metal building nestled in the trees, the sun glinting off its roof. My workshop. It was never just a building. It was my fortress, my laboratory, my legacy. The very thing Karen had tried to tear down had become the source of her downfall, the instrument of her exile, and the foundation of the community's renewal. The victory wasn't just that I had saved my property. It was that in doing so, we had reclaimed our neighborhood. The air here felt lighter now. The whispers of the pines seemed less like secrets and more like songs. I walked back to my workshop, the place where it all started, the satisfying weight of my tools waiting for me. I had a new idea for a more efficient energy storage system I wanted to sketch out. The work, after all, was never done, and I finally had the peace and quiet to do it.